the night of August 13th, 1940, an Azores high-pressure system moves over the Channel coast between France and England. The day dawns with dense cloud banks. After the fog clears over German airfields in France, more than 1,000 German planes take off that afternoon to attack British Royal Air Force bases in southern England. Operation Adlertag, Eagle Day, is underway. The achievement of air supremacy through the total annihilation of the Royal Air Force from the air, to set the stage for an invasion of England by Nazi Germany. What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Though might and fury of the enemy must very soon be turned on us, Hitler knows he must break us in this island or lose the war. With these words, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave the Battle of Britain its name in the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, even before it had begun. Between June and October 1940, the largest air battle in history up to that point was fought over England and the English Channel. In the Battle of Britain for over 4 months, the German Luftwaffe and the British Royal Air Force fought for air superiority. It was a new chapter in the history of warfare. For the first time, a conflict was fought only by the air forces involved, and the outcome was decided not by armies with millions of soldiers, but by a few thousand young people on each side. At the end of June, the whole world was astonished by the German military successes in Europe. France had been defeated in a lightning campaign of only 6 weeks. Germany had inflicted massive losses on the Allies and had occupied the Benelux countries and large parts of France during this Western campaign. The British troops on the continent had been encircled near the northern French port of Dunkirk and were just saved from total destruction by an evacuation. However, they had to leave all their heavy equipment behind in France. Most observers in the events of those days were convinced that the fall of France would lead to an immediate invasion of England. But 2 conditions were missing for such an invasion. On the one hand, Hitler hesitated to give the order for such an invasion because his real war objective, a war with the Soviet Union and the conquest of living space in the East, became more and more distant as the war in the West continued. Second, the English Channel formed a natural defense barrier between the French and the British coasts. An invasion of England therefore required an effort from the German Army, Navy and Air Force, for which they were not at all prepared. The island location made England very difficult to attack, as long as the British fleet dominated the seas and the Royal Air Force maintained air supremacy over the British Isles. The British land forces, on the other hand, had few modern weapons left, having had to leave almost everything behind in France. Nevertheless, the British dug defensive positions along the Channel coast and prepared for a possible German invasion. From the newly captured airfields along the Channel coast, German bombers had good access to British sea lanes. They could lay mines from the air and attack Royal Navy ships, even small fishing boats. And so, in those days of July 1940, there were many hard-fought air battles with heavy losses on both sides over the English Channel. In addition to the convoys, the Luftwaffe also attacked British Channel ports and carried out sporadic bombing raids in the west, in the Midlands and along the east coast to test the strength of British air defences. Also, the Germans undertook operations they called Freie Jagd, free hunts, of 100 to 150 fighters sweeping over southern England in search of British Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. However, the British pilots had orders not to attack these German fighter formations unless they were escorting bombers. But already in those days, it became clear that with Fighter Command the Germans had an opponent before them who knew his trade, led technically equal aircraft into the encounters, and was not to be underestimated combat-wise. And if the Luftwaffe had learned anything in the previous weeks, it was that British air defences had eyes. The British radar system that detected fighter and bomber formations coming across the channel early on. And as a result, many of the Luftwaffe's convoy attacks either had to be aborted or were attacked by British fighters before they even had a chance to get close to the target. The Germans knew about British radar. They even had their own radar system, but in the late 1930s, when radio direction finding was in its infancy, the British continued to experiment, taking advantage of the fact that electronics could warn them of an impending attack. But the new system was not infallible. Often the Germans used such a large number of aircraft that British radar reconnaissance was unable to detect focal points of the attack or distinguish between bombers and fighters. The decisive blow against the Royal Air Force was not achieved in the Channel convoy battles, however, because Fighter Command was using its fighters selectively and not in large numbers. Some British pilots were increasingly annoyed that they were repeatedly facing huge formations of Luftwaffe aircraft in squadron strength. British Air Marshal Dowding had to resist intense pressure to throw everything he had into the skies against the major attacks, knowing Fighter Command could achieve victory simply by existing and not risking a decisive battle with the Luftwaffe. Hitler made a peace offer to the British Empire in his Reichstag speech on July the 19th, but in such a form that even a less determined government than that of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would not have accepted it. The dictator reacted to the renewed British rebuff with the instruction to prepare an invasion of southern England using the codename Sea Lion. The German army had few if any troops for amphibious operations and the navy few if any ships to transport an invasion force across the channel. Initially the army planned to cross 40 divisions, including 6 armoured divisions, over a range of 300 kilometers from the west of the Isle of Wight to the mouth of the Thames. Once landed, they could advance from 3 bridgeheads and attempt to encircle London. The Navy considered this to be completely impossible, because the transport space for this number of troops was not available, nor was it possible to secure the area of operations at sea at this range even to a certain extent. It was finally agreed that 13 divisions would be deployed over a range of 130 kilometers from Folkestone to Eastbourne. However, both Wehrmacht branches agreed that the basic prerequisite for such a successful landing was absolute air supremacy over the invasion area. The Luftwaffe first had to eliminate the Royal Air Force. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe chief, was more than willing to do this, although his Luftwaffe was not prepared for such a strategic air war. Göring's optimism even went so far as to convince himself that Operation Sea Lion would not even be necessary once the British felt the full might of his air force. Although the Luftwaffe possessed numerical superiority, this superiority was to prove misleading as the battle progressed. Although the Germans possessed more bombers, both sides had about equal numbers of fighters. The fighter, not the bomber, held the key to victory or defeat in the coming air battles. And when it came to fighters, the British had a significant advantage. Their Hurricanes and Spitfires did not need to fly far to get at the enemy. The German Me-109, their main fighter, could hardly fly from Calais to London and back, taking into account the fuel consumed in air combat. And even then, the Me-109 was forced to stick to rigid routes, which made it much easier for the British defenders. If a German plane was shot down over England and the pilot managed to save himself with a parachute, he was taken prisoner. A British pilot, on the other hand, could simply return to his squadron. Adlertag, Eagle Day. The start of the general air offensive was set for August 13, 1940, after some postponements due to bad weather. Now, a single strike was to bring the decision for the Luftwaffe. Determined and ruthless it was to be. Massive air raids, the Luftwaffe aimed to push the Royal Air Force back from its bases in southern England to the north, in a matter of days, by bombing its airfields and industrial manufacturing facilities. Either the Luftwaffe destroyed the planes and pilots of the Royal Air Force on the ground, or forced them to confront the Luftwaffe by taking off and defending their air bases. Hermann Göring pulled together 2,700 aircraft for this operation, 3 of his 5 air fleets. Air Fleet 2 and Air Fleet 3 stationed along the Channel coast, and Air Fleet 5 based in Norway and Denmark. Before this, on August 12th, there was a first large-scale attack by Erprobungsgruppe 210 on 4 radar stations near Portland and Dover, involving over 200 planes. In this raid, the Erprobungsgruppe used fighter planes converted into bombers, so-called Jabos. The planes approached their targets with a bomb under their fuselage or wings, and after disposing of the bomb load, they could resume combat as regular fighters. However, the radar stations, except for one, were operational again 6 hours after the attack, as only the power supply and some barracks were destroyed, while the radar towers themselves remained undamaged. Early in the morning of August 13th, 50-year-old Colonel Johannes Fink, the Commodore of Kampfgeschwader 2, Combat Squadron 2, looked up at the sky in surprise. Ahead of him, coming from England, a thick bank of clouds rolled towards the Channel area directly into his flight path. The Luftwaffe meteorologists had not predicted anything like this for him. This did not make his task of gathering the 74 bombers of his squadrons over the airfields near Arras any easier. He had to form them into 3 attack groups and bring them on course. He and his crews were the Luftwaffe's low-flying experts and equipped with Dornier 17 bombers. That morning, all along the Channel coast in German-occupied France, hundreds of German bombers, accompanied by close to 1,000 fighter planes, rose to fly against England. The cloud cover hung at 500 meters, but it wasn't just the weather that worried Colonel Fink. It was 7:30 a.m. over the English Channel, and there was no sign of the fighters at the rendezvous point for his fighter protection. Kampfgeschwader 2 was to be escorted by 60 Bf-110s of Destroyer Squadron 26 under the command of one-legged Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Huth. But Huth and his destroyers were not there. What Fink did not know, his Do 17 squadron was not part of a large bomber armada flying against England, but completely on its own. The weather had changed in the early morning hours, and Hermann Göring had cancelled the attack and postponed it into the afternoon. But this cancellation had not been received by all frontline units in time, so the 74 Do 17 bombers had taken off almost alone. Huth's Messerschmitt 110 was also already in the air, and he saw Fink's bombers heading for England when he received word of the cancellation over the radio. But he was unable to inform Fink's bombers, for to make matters worse, the radios of Fink's Do 17s had not yet received a technical innovation and were transmitting on the wrong frequency. In a last desperate maneuver, Huth pursued the bombers, and when he caught up with them, he tried to attract the attention of the bomber crews by flying acrobatics. Colonel Fink could make no sense of Huth's flying. The clouds now became so dense that the Me-110 destroyer also disappeared. But Fink was not worried about this. However, since Huth's flying acrobatics had proven to him that the fighters had kept their rendezvous and were now surely buzzing around somewhere near the bombers. As attack leader of Kampfgeschwader 2, Fink now had to bring his aircraft on course. Behind him followed the 2nd and 3rd groups under Lieutenant Colonel Paul Wittges and Major Fuchs. The target? Eastchurch Airfield in Kent, the first of many attack targets on Eagle Day. And so, without any fighter protection, Fink's Kampfgeschwader 2 roared through the dense clouds toward Kent. Fink paid close attention to any stragglers. In such a weather, his first concern was for the new and inexperienced crews, who could easily lose contact. His stray sheep, as Fink called them. Tightly bunched together, the Doe 17 units pushed through the cloud cover and flew on, barely 500 meters above the English mainland, close to the cloud base in hope of continuing to remain undetected. But the Luftwaffe's low-flying experts had already been picked up by British radar on their approach over the channel. Fortunately, however, bad weather prevented effective analysis of the British Observation Corps. They reported only a few aircraft and a vague flight direction. Too late, the fighter control officer at Hornchurch sent a 74th Spitfire squadron into the air to intercept the Germans. By then, at an altitude of just under 500 meters, the Doe 17 formations were only 5 kilometers from Eastchurch Airfield. In front of Fink, the clouds opened up. The sun came through and he saw before him the neatly lined up English aircraft on the ground, wing to wing, almost inviting. To get the maximum effect out of a carpet of bombs, each observer of his Doe 17s aimed at his own target. Just at that moment, it happened that the sun broke brightly through the clouds again, blinding the gunners of the last group of Doe 17s. And without any warning, under the cover of the glaring light, the Spitfires of the 17th 4th Squadron swooped down on the 24 aircraft of the rear group of KG-2. But the other 50 bombers of the 1st and 2nd groups could not be forced to turn away by the Spitfires and flew on undeterred toward Eastchurch. Because of the whims of the weather, no alarm had yet been sounded at the airfield. The base commander had been roused from his bed by the telephone and was just able to throw himself into a splintered trench, and the first of 250 bombs of the Doe 17s screeched in. For the people on the ground, it seemed as if all the bombs arrived almost simultaneously. They destroyed 5 Bristol Blenheim bombers and Spitfires of 266 Squadron, killed 12 people and wounded 26, crushed the fighter control center, all telephone and power connections, and fuel supplies. Major John Thompson's 111th Squadron of Hurricanes were patrolling along over Folkestone's coast early that morning. There Thompson, high out of the sun, saw 10 of Fink's Dornier's bombers on their return flight, heading for the Thames estuary and the open sea in a rapid flight without any fighter protection. Immediately he set his Hurricanes in a dive for a direct attack. Tracer rounds and shrapnel pierced the fuselages of the Doe 17s and exploded engine hoods. 10 more Dorniers trying to close up from the rear were caught in the same spell of fire. The battle was over in a few minutes and 5 Dorniers and 2 Hurricanes were shot down. No sooner had he returned to his airfields around Arras in France that Colonel Fink was beside himself with rage. His mood grew even worse when he learned that his rearguard, which had been attacked by the 74th Squadron, had also suffered casualties. He stormed to the telephone and demanded clarification from his superior, Field Marshal Kesselring, about the mess with the fighters. Only now did Fink learn of Göring's halting order and the postponement of Adlertag until the afternoon. Eagle Day on August the 13th was to mark a new phase in the Luftwaffe's fight against Britain. But by noon it was clear that Eagle Day had so far gone wrong all around. For example, Kampfgeschwader 54, which was scheduled for a second attack on Portland Naval Base, received word of the postponement of the main strike and therefore remained on the ground. But its fighter escorts, the Me-110s of Destroyer Squadron 2, had received no such word. As the destroyers flew toward Portland, looking for the bombers, they were suddenly attacked by 40 Spitfires and Hurricanes, losing 5 planes in as many minutes before the fast twin-engine but lumbering Messerschmitts could form a defensive circle, with one Me-110 backing the other. With a delay of almost 10 hours, the wave of attacks on additional Royal Air Force bases, which had been planned for the early morning, began now in the afternoon. But the element of surprise was gone. As soon as radar signals showed that German aircraft were heading for an RAF airfield, everything that could fly took off from there. Southampton Harbour was also a target that afternoon. Some 150 German aircraft, Junkers Ju-88 horizontal and Ju-87 dive bombers and their fighter escorts were to attack there. But while the twin-engine Ju-88s were fast enough, even fully loaded, to sustain a dogfight with British Hurricanes, the Stukas, the Ju-87s, proved easy prey. Worse, the RAF's 609th Fighter Squadron, equipped with the latest Spitfires, became aware of a formation of 40 Ju-87s and several Messerschmitts at high altitudes. With the sun behind them, the British planes attacked the Stukas in a steep descent and shot down 9 of them and one Bf-109. Nevertheless, the German side considered itself the victor of August the 13th. Hermann Göring had champagne served for his crews. The Wehrmacht report announced the destruction of 88 enemy fighters, 70 of them Spitfires or Hurricanes, and 18 of the twin-engine Bristol Blennens, which, like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, proved too immobile for air combat. 12 German aircraft had been lost. The Royal Air Force, on the other hand, reported 13 of its own fighters lost, and 23 Do-17s, Ju-87s, Ju-88s and Heinkel 111s shot down, as well as 11 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Bf-110s. These figures were correspondent to reality, as far as it is known. After 10 days of a grueling offensive, air superiority came within reach for Göring's troops on the morning of the August 24th. The Royal Air Force losses in personnel were just too heavy. On the next attack the following night, however, something happened that turned the previous course of the Battle of Britain on its head. Some German bombers accidentally dropped their deadly cargo on the City of London instead of aircraft factories. Despite the heavy losses and ultimately unsatisfactory successes, Eagle Day was followed by a series of other large-scale attacks on Royal Air Force bases and airfields over the next week and a half. Such as on August 18th, the day with the heaviest losses during the entire Battle of Britain. During the large-scale raids with almost 1,000 Luftwaffe sorties and 927 British fighter interceptions, close to 70 German planes were shot down, but only about 30 RAF fighters. 10 British pilots died and 11 were seriously wounded. The Luftwaffe lost 8 times as many crew as killed, wounded and captured. With more attacks by the Luftwaffe, the Royal Air Force was to be worn down further, but this did not happen. On the contrary, in the end it was the German units that despaired, because they did not succeed in decisively engaging and destroying the British fighters.